Matt and Michelle, I want to welcome you to a conversation here at the Linden Street Cafe coffee shop. It's a wonderful opportunity for us to be together here in the midst and have this conversation. We want to talk about prophetic imagination in congregations. And for many of us, I think we have an understanding that that is part of the DNA of who we are and what it means for us in our particular movement. But I think maybe before we go on into the conversation, I want to at least offer up kind of a definition that we want to use here for LCM, and then kind of have some conversation around that. We want to be able to share that for us, the prophetic imagination is how we are in relationship with God, with others, when we see the situations that are going on around us and the relationships that as they are, and as they ought to be. So if we use that kind of as the definition, let's unpack a little bit about what each of you have come to understand about prophetic imagination. So Matt, I'm going to ask you, can you give us a little bit of a definition of what you think prophetic imagination is?
Yeah, when I think of prophetic imagination, I think of how the prophets saw things in their relationship to the people and in their role as spokesperson and advocate for the possibilities that God made possible. I think of that disruptive space that they must have lived in to perceive what was going on in the land and to see what God could do and what was possible through the lives of the people if they reclaimed that covenant and lived that relationship the way it was intended.
Sure. Go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, when you start talking about living the way it was intended, I'm thinking about, the saying about preaching with a newspaper in one hand and the Bible in the other, and
Sure.
thinking about, having the world as it is on the one hand and the world as God envisions it. And so as we begin to open ourselves up and start to see, with God's eyes a little bit, start to see what's possible, that's kind of what prophetic imagination means for me. Starting to catch a glimpse of what God envisions for the world. And once that happens, then we can't be satisfied with the way world is, as is, without doing something about it. We can't just stay there.
So does that mean that you think God is on the move?
Yeah, absolutely.
And what does that look like then when we say if God is on the move? And how do we respond to that?
So I think God is at work in the world and within us, bringing the world to the way it was intended to be as it was created. That's what God is doing in the world. And so if we want to be part of that with God, then that requires movement on our part too. That means movement and change and transformation. And I think that's kind of part of the prophetic imagination process.
Sure. Yeah, and it's almost like we're saying that as disciples, individual disciples, but also as congregations, if we believe that God is on the move and that is causing a shift, a disruptive space, then we cannot remain in a static experience as an individual or as congregations. Something is going to be changing because God is moving amongst us. Is that kind of what the prophets experienced within the Hebrew text as we've come to understand them today?
I think very much so. I think the way that we can access that experience as we read about it in Scripture is staying in touch with the practices that we referenced earlier. It's easy to slip into, I think, what I might call a cultural mode of making a plan about what our ideal for our church or for our community is. But that's not the prophetic imagination. The prophetic imagination is a creative and a moving, dynamic space that we maintain contact with through our relationships that we're building in our community and the spiritual practices that keep us in touch with that spirit. It's a three-dimensional type of idea. It's
Sure.
not one way. Right. And I think that's what makes it different than a simple plan of this is what it should look like. Let's create a strategic plan and carry that out. God may be moving in ways that constantly surprise us, and keeping our attention on that spirit keeps us in touch with the prophetic as we see it unfolding in our scriptures.
So one of the experiences that happens in my life is that as I sense God's disruptive presence moving in my life, it's requiring me to clear out some space. And so the more times that I'm using spiritual practices, I'm actually freeing up space in order for God to be able to move in that space. And I don't know if that's your experience, but that's kind of what I'm sensing. It's a divine place, but I've got to clear it out. And I do the practices, like things like dwelling in the Word, or maybe walking the neighborhood, where I'm able to be more fully in tuned and paying attention to, is this really as God sees as it should be? And that's the question I would ask in the midst of that practice. I don't know if that's anything you've had experience around.
Absolutely. I was thinking about what you said about it not being about plans, and I think, yeah, it's very much our fallback to say, I want to make a plan and use a formula and create systems, and yet, that's not what this is about at all. We do the spiritual practices. We spend time dwelling in the Word and make some space there to spend time with the images and the words in Scripture, and we give them some time to percolate in us. And then, although the world may be the same, suddenly it's reframed for us. The vision is different. We see things differently. Things come into focus. We start to see things maybe a little bit the way God sees them, and some things we realize are so much less important and appear now to us as clutter, that are just in the way. Sure. And then other things appear as really important and start to take shape before us. And the imagination part of prophetic imagination means that it's a creative process, it's a poetic process, it's an artistic process that can't just be boiled down to a one-size-fits-all formula. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah. So one of the ideas then that I'd like to spend some time in conversation around is this idea of how do we, in our pastor leadership teams, how do we cultivate hope within the midst of our congregations, and why is the idea of hope something that is important in envisioning God's future? Can we unpack that a little bit and say what of the element of hope do we need to kind of respond to here?
One of the things that comes immediately to mind is, I think, a challenge for a lot of us who are involved in congregational life and that we run into, and we really take hope seriously, not only for our own congregations, but for the communities in which we're planted. I've worked with more than one congregation where there's a sense of despair, perhaps, that's right below the surface, or maybe we'll just say real concern about the hope they have for their own congregation. Yeah. There's fear for their own future. What is the future of our congregation? What do we do with the fact that our congregation is graying and that the world is changing? And for me, I have found that one of the most creative, dynamic, and transformational things about hope is that as hope operates in the prophetic imagination, hope draws us into the space where we realize that the answers to our own prayers, to our own concerns, lie in the welfare of the congregation or the communities where our congregations are planted. Somewhere where our concerns and need for hope intersects with the need for hope from the people who live in our surrounding community. That's where God's future lies. And drawing us into that space through prayer, but through building those relationships that broaden our vision of what God is doing with the church is really where the hope draws us.
And one of the foundational aspects of leading congregations in mission is that it's about being in relationship with God, with one another, and with our neighborhoods and so on and so forth. So if the call is for us to be in relationship and we see things that might be broken in our neighborhoods, how do we then re-encounter what God's vision is for that particular neighborhood if we're not in relationship with folks there? And that's kind of the invitation about being in relationship and discovering the hope as we see how God is moving in that particular area. That's just an idea.
Yeah, we've been talking for some time in LCM about the fact that mission is relational, and I think that the most spiritual thing you can do is enter into relationship with someone else, and the way we do that is through stories, through sharing stories, and so just as we practice that. Amongst the pastor leadership team, the sharing in the round, the sharing our stories with each other, and we are sharing that in our congregation, that we need to also be engaging with our community, with our neighborhood, with the people around us, and start to build those relationships and start to hear what's really going on in their lives. What are the joys? What are the sorrows? What are the hurts, the injustices? And start to really understand what's going on around us in the neighborhood, because a lot of times our congregations don't know. We just don't know what's going on around us.
That's right. So let's look at another question. If we're going to look about cultivating hope with our pastor leadership teams in the midst of the congregation, let's understand, for me at least, that the spiritual practices that we're asking people to engage in, those practices that help shape us for mission, are created in order to help free up space for us, not add another layer on. And far too often folks might feel like, oh, I just can't do anymore. I'm already giving so much. So if it's freeing up some space. So how is it possible for our congregations to be able to increase the capacity to imagine the future that God intends and to be in mission with God? And how do we actually do that to unlock the creativity that is within us in order that we can imagine what God is doing if God's on the move, is what we're saying in the midst of that neighborhood? What do you think?
I think it starts with the stories that we share with one another, the things that we celebrate. So do we tell stories about the disruption that's happening that maybe tells us we're on the right track to hearing what God's up to in the world around us? Do we start sharing and celebrating the way the Holy Spirit is acting in surprising ways? Do we start celebrating those small efforts to take steps outside? Are those the stories that we're sharing and celebrating in our own community? I think it starts there, and it also starts by our ability to start to engage with people, make a safe place to engage with people outside our community, outside our congregation. And I'm thinking of a time in a Sunday school class, an adult class, where we were all, our congregation was not in a residential area, kind of an industrial area, so there weren't exactly houses around, but we were all marched out to the street, which was a busy street, and we were told, pick someone driving by to pray for, which I realize is kind of a form of walking the neighborhood, right?
Yeah,
we're out
sure.
there and we're praying, and we came back in and shared who we prayed for, and people shared, they prayed for a young man this age, or they prayed for someone who looked like a young mother, and we started to realize that their concerns, the concerns of the people around us in our neighborhood were our concerns as well. And that was kind of revelatory for us and a profound first step towards engaging.
Did you find that freeing to be able to have that kind of conversation?
Yes, because we'd never thought about the people outside before.
And you had an expectation now. You're going to pay attention to what was going on around in that regard.
Yeah, it changed. That simple thing changed a lot of things for us.
Matt, do you have any ideas about this capacity question?
Yeah, I think for me, it's a dynamic process, and so it's hard to nail down one piece. I keep coming back to this idea that increasing our capacity for prophetic imagination and creating a space where our capacity to deal with the discomfort and the disruption that comes with that, as we used to say in the congregation I was in for quite a while, to let God mess up our lives. Came from reorienting our attention away from just our congregation, meaning the people who were in the pews on Sunday morning, and started thinking about God's prophetic work in the community that was around us, and getting in touch with the lives that were there, and changing our attention of where God is doing God's work. In some way, I'm repeating the things that we've already said, But by allowing those things to happen, the questions changed,
Sure.
and our attention shifted
Right.
about what it meant to be a prophetic people. It was getting in touch with other people's lives and letting their life experience become fodder for disrupting our life's experience and sharing in that vision for something
You
better.
allow the relationships to shape the conversation and begin to imagine the possibilities of the things that God was already doing in the midst of their neighborhood. And so that relationship was real key. That's what I'm hearing you say, is that relationship is key.
It is key. It is key because the prophetic imagination, as I understand it, always draws us outside of ourselves and what we know to the boundaries of what we know, to where our relationships with others and our relationship with God intersects to create new possibilities for the life of our faith and our life together.
So how do we deal with the prophetic imagination inviting us to expand the boundaries beyond where we currently think we're safe? How do we invite people to look at expanding those boundaries just a little bit? What does that look like? You brought up the idea of boundaries, so I'm going to push it a little bit more.
I think there's permission giving, letting you know it's okay to try some things, and that we can come back and we can celebrate the things that went well and laugh together about the things that we were silly about. And I think having a good sense of humor is going to be really important here, because things are going to go wrong, things are not going to go the way we expected, funny things are going to happen, and to acknowledge that's part of the process.
Sure.
And to keep celebrating those next faithful steps and the next faithful steps. And
Yeah. See, I'm envisioning, much like we're at a round table right now, what would it look like for us to do that practice of sharing it around and be able to say, imagine what it would look like for us to push out just a little bit more because of the relationships that we have here. And where do we believe that God has a desire out here that we need to pay attention to? So that being engaged in those practices, I believe, will help us understand what it means to expand those boundaries. And I think that's what the prophets were doing, was they were trying to call folks and continue to call us today to expand what we believe to be the perceived boundaries and see what God is doing in the midst of that.
I think part of what's transformational about what we're trying to put words on and trying to talk about it is some of the markers that we're used to looking to judge whether we're moving in the right direction or the wrong direction actually flip. They change. Oftentimes we're in a setting where when things are going well and things are going smoothly, we think we must be on the right track. The prophetic imagination doesn't work that way. All we have to do is break open our own scriptures and read the experience of the prophets to realize it was in those moments of disruption. It was in those moments of naming where injustices or where opportunities were to discover what God was doing, that we were able to recognize this is where the movement is.
Oh.
This is where the Spirit is. So our moments of discomfort and disruption end up becoming indicators that we need to stay with this. Mm-hmm. We need to move deeper because there's a moment of discovery that awaits in that process. And it's not something that a formula can help us arrive at.
Right.
It's only something that through our practices and time spent that the Spirit slowly unfolds with us. And it's my experience that reinforces my testimony about that.
So does it seem in the midst of this conversation that the notion of prophetic imagination is calling us to live in the edge of those spaces and to be able to maybe experiment a little bit around what are the possibilities about what God is envisioning in the midst of that, so that it's okay to be really on the edges of those boundaries and kind of looking and seeing and paying attention to and asking the question, God, what are you up to here, and what is the dream that you have that you're calling us to? I think I hear that being articulated if we're going to move to the edges to be able to do some of that work.
I think that's exactly it. I imagine a point in what I might call the prophetic experience, where the prophets are identifying with what seems like to be obvious needs or moments of disruption where they realize some change needs to take place. But as they stay in touch with God through their practices and their reliance on God, and stay with that disruptive experience, there's a point in which the voice that speaks is no longer just theirs. That they begin to discover the clarity that God brings to this experience of disruption and change. And that is where new moments of clarity and transformed perspectives really begin to happen.
Yeah. In those very places where it seems like everything we knew about life is vanishing and fear or chaos is taking its place, there's a way to see this as the very place where new shapes, new forms, new ways of being God's community are just taking place. They're just coming out of the mist, and it's not all completely clear to us, but the spiritual practices in our journey as a people, it starts to become more and more clear.